Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this episode of Sharia Intelligence, where I will be joined by Brother Nasir Bello and Brother Ibrahim Bello, volunteers and top facilitators in this course. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemo, and today we will carry on in discussing the subject of certainty when it comes to texts. We have touched on this, but I would like us to spend a little bit more time on this subject of qat'il wurud or qat'il thubut or dhanni thubut, the level of certainty, how absolutely certain are scholars, or what level of presumption do they have when it comes to the sources of evidence, and how and why scholars differed on this. I'd like to start with Malam Ibrahim Bello. We've touched on hadith ahad, hadith mutawatir, the implications, but don't you think, if somebody were to ask, that this classification is superfluous, it's not useful? Isn't it enough that a hadith is sahih, it's authentic? Is this difference and looking for collaboration not just philosophical? Is it really necessary? Most of us have not heard of hadith mutawatir, hadith ahad. We just know something is, sahih or hasan, and that's good enough for action. And then, okay, if it's munkar or maudu, or, it has a problem with it. Is it really necessary when most hadith belong to ahad category? Is it important to discuss and distinguish between ahad and mutawatir? Is this really useful? And why is it important?
Yeah, it is useful. But many might find it irrelevant because it is not their area of specialization. Okay, for hadith scholars, the classification were concerned with maqbool or mardud, and is it authentic, should be accepted or not, sahih, da'if. But then it is actually useful to scholars who make law, the muftis and the mujtahids. Why? Because they just want to be sure the level of certainty and the imperativeness of a law produced by each hadith based on the strength of its authenticity. So in that regard, many might not, because of course even in the past, mujtahid were few who were actually at the echelon or the top of the scholarship. So that is why many might find it's irrelevant, but it's actually relevant, and it's an old classification that was not done today. Yes.
In other words, they all accept the hadith that are authentic. They just differ on what you can do with that type of hadith. Exactly. Nasir, what would you add to this discussion?
Well, I think particularly to mujtahid scholars, the classification is critical, particularly in trying to establish the fundamentals of the deen, what is called ma'lum min ad-deen bid-darura, as I discussed earlier in another episode. That is the fundamentals of Islam, the issue of salat, the issue of fasting, and other pillars of Islam. Again, it is important in establishing aqidah for them. That classification is critical because these are things that will allow them to identify the mutawatir from the ahad, and you would find them trying to argue that mutawatir are the only evidence that are used in establishing aqidah or ma'lum min ad-deen bid-darura, or trying to, and it's equally important for them in trying to classify the Zanni texts in terms of their certainty and authority. They equally look at it, particularly if you look at the Maliki and the Hanafi school, they need that to be able to qualify, to define what is haram and what is fard, just like the issue of takfir, because then you have to get something that is mutawatir according to them. So because of these reasons, you would find essentially scholars of usul, mujtahid scholars, considering this classification as very critical for them to be able to come up with rulings based on what is actually the provision of the field of usul al-fiqh and maqasid.
So what you are saying is, starting with the point you made, Malam Ibrahim, which is there's the first stage which hadith scholars would do in sieving what is authentic and accepted and what is rejected.
Yes.
But after the hadith scholars have gathered what is accepted, then the question of the authority of what has been accepted. And the mujtahids are concerned with, again, with the help of hadith scholars, which of these hadith are we certain beyond a shadow of doubt because they corroborate each other, and which of these hadith do not give us that level of certainty. In other words, even after you've gathered authentic hadith, the issue of what are you going to do with it, the question of certainty. Now, Nasir, you also mentioned that for lawmaking, therefore, like where it comes to Aqidah, that's a very important issue because it deals with whether you're a Muslim or not a Muslim. On really important issues, it's not enough just to say because it is probably or most probably true that we end up, saying somebody is out of Islam when he should be in, or in when he should be out. So this question of what is the issue, could you say more on how the scholars of fiqh differed? We're talking of the Hanafis, the Malikis, and these other great scholars, the Shafis, the Hanbalis, and the Zahiris, and all these other great mujtahid scholars. How did they differ, and what could they use these single-chained hadith for, and what would they not agree to use these hadith for?
Usually, you don't find them differing, or to a large extent, you would say there is agreement amongst them when it comes to the independence, the authority of mutawatir hadith as an independent evidence, just like the Quran. When it comes to making a ruling, it can go to any length. It can make a fard, it can make a wajib, it can make a haram, and what have you. But when it comes to the khabar ahad, or what we call hadith ahad, then you will find them coming up with lots of limitation regarding its application and what it can do. For example, if you look at the Hanafi school, for them, hadith ahad can only get to the level of makruh tahrimi and of course wajib. That means it cannot make a haram or fard.
So a haram is like a categorical.
Yeah, that is categorical prohibition. It cannot get to that level. So this is the limitation, and that is why you find them coming up with lots of rulings, like proposing for a marriage to somebody that has been already proposed to. For them, if you look at other schools, they went ahead to say this is not allowed, this is prohibited. But in the Hanafi school, because this is an ahad hadith, what it can only get to is the level of makruh tahrimi. And again, another interesting thing about the position of Hanafi school with regard to limitations of ahad hadith is the issue of ahad hadith not being able to specify or qualify a general ruling or general statement in the Quran or Sunnah mutawatir, just like the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ or the Prophet was reported to have said there is no prayer without recitation of Surah Al-Fatiha. This is specifying a verse in the Quran which talks about reciting whatever is possible from the Quran, and therefore for them that hadith cannot specify something that has been generalized in the Quran. That is part of the limitation in the Hanafi school of ahad hadith. Now, if you go to the Maliki school, you would find them equally limiting ahad hadith, particularly if it has no any corroboration or no any support from the amal or any other critical source of Sharia, and therefore you would find them limiting it to mustahab or makruh, while in other schools they can get to the level of haram, just like you find in the Hanbali school that doesn't have problem with ahad hadith getting to the extent of prohibition or becoming a fard. And some of the examples you will find with the Maliki school is the issue of washing bowls that were licked by dogs, that was touched by dog saliva, the hadith of washing 7 times. For them, it's just mustahab instead of making it wajib, because it's sort of a command. And another example that you will also find with the Maliki school, particularly on the role of amal they consider ahad hadith as being irregular if it has no any backing or support of amal. Typical example is this wordings of adhan. They decided to choose the hadith of Bilal, which has 2 takbir, is against the hadith of Abu Ma'adhura, which has 4 takbirs, because of the amal of Al al-Madina, which supports the hadith of Bilal instead of that of Abu Ma'adhura, that was actually accepted by some other schools. So these are some of the examples that you find, particularly with Maliki and the Hanafi school, as it relates to ahad hadith.
Inshallah. And,
Okay.
Ala Ibrahim,
Yes, sir.
what do you have to say on the other schools, brother? Nasir touched on the Hanafi perspective of ahad hadith and what it can and cannot do, and you mentioned how, unlike other schools, an ahad hadith cannot qualify a general statement of the Quran. So if the Quran says, "Faqru ma tayassara min al-Quran," recite whatever you find easy from the Quran in Salat. When it comes to Fatiha, even though there's a hadith that says you must recite Fatiha, without Fatiha your Salat is not accepted, the Hanafis look at that single chain hadith as not enough to stand the general statement of the Quran saying read whatever you find easy. So for them, they would encourage reciting, but they would not say you don't have a prayer. And I think this is important, that it's not about do they know the hadith or do they not know the hadith. Some would simply say they are not aware of the hadith. Here we find, no, they are aware of the hadith. They just differ in how much authority it gives. What can you say regarding the Shafi'i and some of the other schools?
Yeah, like in contrary to Maliki and Hanafi, the Shafi'is are of the opinion that ahad hadith is authoritative enough as long as it is authentic to make haram, to make wajib. So to them, like the example of kullu zina bimina sibai and all of that, like carnivorous animals and birds of prey, to them is haram. Even though the hadith is ahad, but it's haram. Similarly, the Zahiris are of similar position. Zahiris don't differentiate between hadith ahad and mutawatir on issue of making rulings. So in essence, all of them agree. The Shafi'i, Hanbali, Maliki, Hanafi, that ahad hadith are a source of guidance and giving directions or rulings. They only differ on the degree of liability of rulings produced or generated from ahad hadith.
So this is good to know, that when it comes to Quran and Hadith Mutawatir, they all agree these are qat'i thubut.
Yeah,
these are definitive regarding their authenticity and authority. When it comes to Hadith Ahad, they all consider these as dhanni thubut, that these are presumptive regarding their authority and not as strong, and so can't establish the fundamental essentials of the deen, the ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura. They can't establish essential aqidah. They can establish secondary issues, but of course there will be differing opinions there. I'd like you, Malam Ibrahim, to shed more light on how do the scholars differ when it comes to the authority of solitary hadith, ahad hadith, when compared to the other secondary sources of law. Do they consider them stronger or the same? Brother Nasir was mentioning, and you've other times mentioned, how for the Maliki, it's not just Quran and Sunnah Mutawatir that are qat'i thubut, but even though they consider Amal Ahl al-Madina as dhanni, they don't put them in the same category as the qat'i thubut, the Quran and Sunnah Mutawatir, but they do consider Amal Ahl al-Madina as more authoritative than solitary hadith, than ahad hadith. And in fact, if for the early Malikis, if ahad hadith is not supported by amal, it is rejected or just treated as shaz. What can you tell us regarding how the schools rank ahad hadith? They accept it, but how do they rank it with other tools that they accept from secondary sources?
Okay. Now, let's start with Hanafi, because he came earlier. Hanafi will say if an evidence that is clear-cut, like cut is thubut, established, or istihsan, contradicts ahad hadith, these ones are given preference over ahad hadith. In fact, qiyas and ijma too, if they contradict ahad hadith, Hanafi will still go back, resort to these truths, even though they might look secondary. To them, they are more authoritative than ahad hadith. Like ahad hadith doesn't have that grant or position to challenge these truths. The Maliki also, similarly, if an evidence is clear-cut, cut is thubut, and then it contradicts ahad hadith, of course, nobody has issue with that, like cut is thubut. But even Masalih al-Mursala, Istihsan, Amalu Ahl al-Madina, all of these to them are superior in establishing a ruling to ahad hadith. So to them, not the ahad hadith is not useful, but the order. You see, the Hanafis, they are looking at after cut is thubut, istihsan, ijma, qiyas, all come before hadith ahad in the equation. To Maliki, cut is thubut, amal ahli al-Madina, masali al-mursala, and ijma, all of these come before hadith ahad in the equation, as in what comes first. If it's not in Quran and Sunnah where you have a cut is thubut, cut is dilala, or hadith mutawatir, where else do we source? So hadith is like not the first port of call. They have other things before.
This is interesting. Ala Nasir, what would you add from the other schools?
I think just like he rightly mentioned, if you look at the schools and the priority they associate, which is actually based on their understanding of what is certain and what is presumptive, in that order, you would find the Hanafi bringing the Quran, Sunnah, Mutawatir, Istihsan, Ijma, Qiyas, then Sunnah Ahad. Just like you would find the Malikis bringing Quran, Sunnah, Mutawatir, Istihsan, Amal, Maslaha, Qiyas, then they bring Sunnah Ahad. And even the Shafi'is would give priority to Quran, Sunnah, Mutawatir, they will give priority to Ijma and Qiyas, then they will bring Sunnah Ahad. The only exception to that order, which brings Quran, Sunnah, Mutawatir, then Sunnah Ahad, is the Hanbali school, in the way they rate and the authority they associate to Sunnah Ahad. But again, if you look, there are intra differences between scholars of different these schools within the same school. For example, even with the issue of the support that Amal gives to Ahad Hadith as a basis for acceptance or rejection or considered irregular. If you look at the schools within the Maliki school, because there are about 5 schools within the Maliki school, they have the school of Baghdad, that of Egypt, that of Maghrib, that of Andalus. You would find them differing, and of course the school of Malik in Medina, you would find them differing as regards how they relate with this idea of whether Ahad can stand, whether as an independent tool or with the support of us. So you would find differences in opinion among scholars, independent scholars within a particular school, or different subcategory of schools, just like we have in the Maliki school. Usually you would find the Maliki school in Medina becoming associating more strength in the support that is needed for Ahad by Amal than you would find by, for example, the Maliki school in Baghdad or in Egypt, and you would find those of Maghrib and Andalus also having a different view regarding this kind of nuances and variations. And you will equally see that when you go to the Hanbali school, particularly with later scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and the likes, when it comes to this order of categorization and what they consider more authoritative than the other. Allahu Alam.
This is all very interesting, that if there's no conflict in the evidence, then they all have no problem with Ahad Hadith. Probably just the Malikis, the early Malikis, who would limit the authority of Ahad without, if it doesn't come with support, and the Hanafis who would also limit the type of rulings that ahad can give as independent sources. But these can change if the ahad have secondary support, other sources, other support. But as you mentioned, even within each school, you would sometimes find diversity of opinions. But something I think very important to remember is that there's an order in the authority of all sources of evidence, but they all agree on Quran and Hadith Mutawatir as being number 1 and number 2. And it is number 3 that you find contentious, or the contentions or the differences begin. Is the third one, Amal Ahl al-Madina, according to the Malikis? Is the third one Ijma, as the Shafis would put? Is the third one Istihsan, as the Hanafis would put? Or is the third one Ahad Hadith, as most of the Hanbalis would put? But as you've mentioned, even within the Hanbali, we find differences like that of Ibn Taymiyyah on a number of issues. However, and Mal Nasir, some would say that Imam Shafi'i was of the opinion, and they take that as representing probably a strong view of Shafi'i, that any hadith that is authentic is the madhab I belong to, and any hadith that is contrary to my opinion, just throw my opinion against the wall. This seems to suggest that Shafi'i was saying that, solitary hadith, or the moment a hadith is authentic, then it overrides every other evidence. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think this is a very popular statement that is associated to Shafi'i, and you would find some great scholars, particularly Imam al-Qarafi, trying to engage that particular statement by saying, if what Shafi'i meant by this statement is that what is accepted from an authentic hadith, if it does not contradict much more stronger evidence, then this is something that is a consensus or acceptable by all scholars or agreed upon. So there is nothing new or different about what is known among scholars. However, if what he meant is, even if it contradicts much more stronger evidence, he still goes along with that, then he said that means Shafi'i has actually differed with the opinion or the consensus of scholars on that particular statement.
It's interesting. Yeah. What would you add?
Regarding the statement
of Shafi'i, if a hadith goes contrary to my opinion, throw my opinion away. Because what Malam Nasir has explained is that of Qarafi's interpretation, and if I understand you correctly, that if what Imam Shafi'i is saying is that a Sahih hadith that is not conflicting with anything else would be opinion he would take, then yes, but that would be the opinion of most scholars. Whereas if a Sahih hadith that is Ahad conflicts with others, then it goes against what Shafi'i himself does. Would you have anything to add to?
Yeah, I think what is important is to look at, not just to interpret the statement of Shafi'i, in vacuum, but relate it to his own approach personally, not just statement. Sometimes when you misunderstand what somebody says, you say, let's look at how we apply this. Shafi'i himself will not prefer hadith ahad to what he called ijma'u sahaba. To him, after Quran and Sunnah mutawatira, he used to give preference to this. And you could see that he even changed some of his opinion after he left Malik, based on new experience he got in Baghdad. So it is not as simple as if hadith is authentic, okay, it's not just authenticity on the surface, but considering other factors. Yes.
If you could give some words of advice to people who, the moment they hear a hadith, they quickly want to know, is it ahad? If so, then I don't have to take it seriously. What advice would you give as words of caution when it comes to people dealing with ahad hadith?
Number one, it's good to know that the whole essence of this classification is just for us to respect diversity of scholarship and why scholars differ. But hadith ahad are not less authoritative than other evidence. It's just that whenever they conflict with a stronger evidence, which is Quran and Sunnah mutawatira, then we should be cautious. But that doesn't in any way reduce their significance in lawmaking in Islam. Because more than 70% of ahadith that are authentic are actually ahad. So if you underplay their role, it means you're going to reinterpret the whole of Islam based on only few hadith that is mutawatir. But the intent is for people to be cautious and careful, that we are bound to differ in the strength we give to rulings of Sharia and interpretations once an evidence falls below the strength of the first category. Also be careful of rushing to what I can call immature conclusion. Yeah, because once there is presumptive, that kind of tendency of being presumptive certainty, then we are bound to differ. Because some scholars will choose to resort to other secondary truths before the hadith. It doesn't mean they don't know the role and the importance of hadith and the prophets. But they are using that because they are on issues that life will be at stake and more difficult decisions will be taken. Let's be very cautious and let's be very careful. And that is what they hold this idea of looking at the bigger picture of this subject area, from usul al-fiqh to maqasid al-sharia to qawaid al-fiqhiyya is important. So that whatever ruling or decision or position we want to take, let's subject it to this kind of cycle of critiquing and see whether it's scaled through. Then we will be safer and we will respect scholarship. And like I say, the whole essence of this one is just for us to be sure we're really submitting to the will of God and we're really taking decision on base we are most sure the Prophet actually say. Wallahu alam.
Malam Nasir, what would you add to this?
Well, I think as he rightly mentioned, sometimes these issues are associated with not necessarily looking at the bigger picture, not trying to look at other evidences that actually will clarify some of these issues, or probably the context of what we call sababul wurud or sababul nuzul, particularly sababul wurud of the hadith. Some of the examples you would find like the hadith of umirtu an uqatil an-nas, where you would find people taking it and trying to use it without necessarily looking at other interpretations that were made by scholars and other much more stronger evidence. For example, the general ruling in the Quran regarding no compulsion in religion, which is seemingly contradicting the kind of interpretation that is given to this particular hadith of Umirtu, and that we are ordered or we are commanded to kill people until and unless they believe in God. And the verse of La ikraha, this is a hadith. Exactly. But then you would find a verse in the Quran that says no compulsion in religion, La ikraha fi din, that the whole idea of accepting Islam is an issue of choice. It's not issue of compulsion. So this kind of seeming contradiction are always there. So the need for us to be very cautious in terms of engaging this kind of things. Or for example, you would find some scholars issuing fatwa with some hadiths regarding the provision of wearing gold by women, when there are other hadiths narrated by Aisha, for example, which talks about the permissibility for women to wear gold. And again, maybe another example, the hadith that talked about salam to non-Muslims, forgetting the context within which that particular statement was made is equally part of the issue. So the need for us to think carefully and be cautious in engaging this kind of examples. Otherwise, it will affect the greater objective of unity, of peace building, and in fact of da'wah within the ummah, and it somehow is in contradiction with what we can see from the life of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam in terms of his relationship with others, in terms of the way he conduct himself, that we were commanded by the Quran to emulate. So we have to look at all these kind of things before we go about interpreting a single chain hadith without necessarily looking at other critical things that are usually around that.
So what you're saying is, I think, for the average person, don't be very careful about dabbling into quick rejection, hasty judgment about a hadith that appears to conflict with something else when you've not really looked at the context. And I think you gave the example of the hadith, Umirtu an uqatil an-nas, I've been ordered to fight people. But when you look carefully, does that really conflict with no compulsion in religion? And as you've explained on other occasions, it doesn't, because this hadith is not saying you should go and initiate fighting. Uqatil from qatala means to fight back. It's reciprocal. So it's not conflicting with no compulsion in religion. The hadith you also brought on the Prophet prohibiting gold to some people, when you look carefully, you find it's his household women that he prohibited, not others. And so there isn't a conflict between this ahad hadith and other hadith. Once you look at the context more carefully, you realize that it would have been very hasty, intellectually arrogant to just throw away ahad hadith just because they appear to conflict with something else. One should probably mention, as we come to a close on this, that many ahad hadith that deal with mu'amalat have contexts that are known by scholars, and many actually that have been accepted by scholars have other forms of evidence like qiyas and maslaha or saddu zariya that support them. In other words, there's an understanding of the benefit, the maqasid behind it, and it's not as simple as it appears to conflict, therefore it's rejected. The need to really be humble in the presence of scholarship and to recognize that this is an area for scholars, and the need to inquire more and not be too hasty in our judgment of single chain hadith that appear to conflict with others. I'd like to thank you both for all your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.